The first time I saw my husband cry, really cry, not the kind of polite misting he allowed himself at funerals, was on a Thursday morning in October, at 8:47, standing in our kitchen, holding a piece of paper like it had burned him. My husband, Arthur Bellamy, was 63 years old. He had run his own insurance brokerage for 22 years. He coached Little League when our boys were young. He served on the church deacon board for a decade. People in Greenville, South Carolina, described him the way people describe men they've never had to depend on. Solid, reliable, successful. A good man. I watched him read that letter twice. Then a third time. His hands were trembling. I didn't ask what it said. I already knew the answer would be something close to the truth, but not quite there. Arthur had been giving me close but not quite for years. What I didn't expect was that within 72 hours, I would know more about my husband's finances than he thought I ever could. And what I knew would change everything. My name is June Bellamy. I am 64 years old, and for most of my marriage, people assumed I left the money to Arthur. That assumption wasn't an accident. It was something carefully built, one small comment at a time, across 31 years. I grew up in Spartanburg. My father drove a delivery truck. My mother cleaned houses twice a week and kept the most organized household ledger I have ever seen. She balanced every penny. She taught me that numbers don't lie, but people who handle numbers sometimes do. I carried that lesson quietly for most of my adult life. Quietly, because quiet was easier. When I met Arthur Bellamy, I was working as an office manager at a pediatric practice. I handled billing, insurance claims, accounts receivable, staff payroll. Nothing glamorous. Everything necessary. I was good at it. I understood the mechanics of money the way some people understand weather. Not perfectly, but well enough to read the signs before the storm arrived. Arthur was different from anyone I had dated. Charming, ambitious. The kind of man who made decisions quickly and made them sound inevitable. We married 3 years after we met. I was 33. He was 32. The boys came quickly after that. Our son Gregory first. Then 2 years later, our younger son Dennis. The early years were genuinely good. We talked. We planned. We argued and made up and laughed at the same things. When Arthur started the brokerage, I helped him set up the initial accounting system. He used to say, I had a sharper eye for numbers than anyone he'd hired. Then the business grew, and something shifted. It happened the way most quiet erosions happen, not dramatically, just gradually. Until one day you look around and realize the landscape has completely changed. Arthur started handling everything financially. At first it seemed practical. He was at the office more. The accounts were tied to business decisions I wasn't involved in. It made sense to let him manage it. But then he stopped explaining things. Then he stopped mentioning them entirely. The first comment I remember was at a neighborhood cookout. Someone asked about refinancing their mortgage, and I started to answer. Arthur touched my arm and laughed. June's better with people than with numbers. Everyone smiled. I smiled too. Later I stood at the kitchen sink and thought about it for a long time. After that, the comments came more regularly. Whenever finances came up at dinner parties, Arthur redirected. Whenever our sons asked about investments or insurance products, Arthur answered and I listened. It became the established order of things. Arthur understood money. June understood everything else. What nobody understood, not even Arthur, I think, was how dangerous that story would eventually become. Not for me, for him. Dennis noticed it first, though he never said anything directly. Our younger son was like me in certain ways. He observed before he spoke. Gregory was more like his father. Confident. Decisive. He'd been working alongside Arthur at the brokerage for 5 years by the time things started to unravel. He knew the business well, or he believed he did. It was Gregory who handed his father the mail that October morning. He'd stopped by to drop off some files before the office opened. He left 20 minutes after Arthur read the letter. Whatever expression Arthur was wearing when Gregory left, it wasn't the one he wore when I came downstairs. What was that? I asked, nodding toward the paper on the counter. Arthur folded it and tucked it under a stack of unopened mail. Just some bank correspondence. I poured my coffee. Which bank? He named one I didn't recognize. Regional lender. Nothing you'd know. That phrase. Nothing you'd know. It was so practiced it sounded natural. I had heard versions of it for 30 years. I nodded. Then I said almost to myself, must be about the Caldwell account. Arthur looked up sharply. What do you know about Caldwell? I didn't know anything about Caldwell. I had seen the name once on an envelope months earlier and filed it away the way I filed most things I didn't understand yet. Quietly. For later, Arthur's reaction told me everything I needed it to. I just see the mail first sometimes, I said. He relaxed. Barely. That evening he was distracted. He checked his phone 6 times during dinner. He took 2 calls in the backyard, both times returning with his expression carefully arranged into something neutral. I had spent 31 years reading that face. Neutral meant worried. I didn't confront him. I had learned over time that confrontation gave Arthur a target. Instead I watched, and I waited. 3 nights later, while Arthur was at a Chamber of Commerce dinner, I sat at the kitchen table with my reading glasses and my laptop and a cup of chamomile tea, and I began searching. Not for anything specific, just for the shape of things. I started with what I knew, the brokerage accounts I was technically attached to as a spouse. Then I moved outward, slowly, carefully, the way I used to reconcile the pediatric practice's billing at the end of each quarter, following one thread until it connected to another. By midnight, I had found 3 things that didn't belong. The first was a company name, Bellamy Caldwell Holdings, LLC. Registered 14 months earlier in the state of South Carolina. I did not recognize it. Arthur's brokerage operated under a completely different corporate name. I wrote it down. The second was an address, listed as the registered business address for Bellamy Caldwell. It was not our home address. It was not the brokerage. It was an address on the east side of Greenville I had never been to. The third was my name, not as a spouse, not as a beneficiary, as a managing member. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I read it again. Then I closed the laptop very gently, because I felt like if I moved too quickly something would break. Managing member. I had never signed anything. I had never attended a meeting. I had never heard of Bellamy Caldwell Holdings until 40 minutes ago. And yet there was my name, plain and legal, in a public state filing, attached to a company I knew nothing about. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was frightened, though I was, but because I kept thinking about my mother's ledger. Numbers don't lie. People do. The next week was the longest of my life. I went through the motions. I cooked. I attended my Thursday morning Bible study. I called Dennis, who lives in Charlotte with his wife Paulette, and I listened to him talk about their new house renovation without mentioning a word of what I was carrying. I smiled at Arthur across the dinner table every night and asked about his day, and he smiled back and told me partial truths, and we both performed the version of our marriage that had become habit. Behind that performance, I was building a picture. I requested documents I was legally entitled to see, accounts connected to my name, property records, business filings. I spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table while Arthur watched television in the other room, going through everything methodically. The way I had been trained to, the way I had always been capable of. What emerged was not clean. It was complicated and layered and deeply unsettling, but the shape of it was becoming visible. Bellamy Caldwell Holdings had taken out 2 significant loans, large ones, both listed collateral. Among those collateral items, one entry made my stomach drop: retirement assets associated with June Bellamy. My retirement accounts. The money I had accumulated carefully over 4 decades of working, the savings I had added to, even after leaving the pediatric practice. The funds Arthur had always described as protected and secure. Apparently they were neither. There was one other name that kept appearing in the documents, a name I didn't recognize at first: Terry Ann Roche. She appeared on corporate paperwork alongside Arthur, on operating agreements, on emails I found forwarded to an account I hadn't known Arthur had, on a property lease for the East Side address. She appeared in photographs at regional insurance industry events. I found them after I started searching her name. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, professional looking, poised, and in nearly every photograph where Arthur appeared, she wasn't far away. I'm a 64-year-old woman who has been married for 31 years. I know the difference between a business colleague and something else. The photographs showed something else. I sat with that knowledge alone for 4 days. Those were the 4 hardest days of my life. Not because I was falling apart, but because I had to hold myself together carefully enough to keep moving forward. Grief is a luxury when you also need evidence. Our son Dennis came to visit that second weekend. He drove up from Charlotte on a Saturday morning, alone. Paulette had a work thing. We sat on the back porch with coffee, and I asked him carefully whether he'd noticed anything different about his father lately. Dennis was quiet for a moment. He looked at his cup. Then he said, "He seems stressed." "Stressed? How? Like he's managing something he doesn't want to talk about?" I nodded slowly. Dennis looked at me directly then. "Mom, what's going on?" I wasn't ready to tell him everything. I wasn't sure what everything was yet. I said, "I'm figuring some things out. I'll tell you when I know more." He didn't push. That was Dennis. He trusted me to be honest when I was ready. Gregory was different. The following Tuesday, he called the house phone, which he almost never did. He and Arthur spoke for 40 minutes. I heard Arthur's voice through the study door. Low, clipped, controlled. The same voice he used when he was working to contain something. After he hung up, Arthur came into the kitchen and told me Gregory was dealing with some brokerage compliance questions. Routine stuff. Nothing to worry about. I said, "Of course." I smiled, and I noticed he hadn't made eye contact when he said it. I called my old friend Patricia Weston 2 days later. Patricia and I had worked together years ago. She left the pediatric practice before me, went back to school, eventually became a financial attorney with a practice in Colombia. We had kept in loose touch. Holiday cards. The occasional phone call. She was the kind of person who never made you feel foolish for not knowing something, which at that particular moment was exactly what I needed. Patricia answered on the second ring. "June. It has been too long." "Yes, it really has." She heard something in my voice within the first 30 seconds. We made small talk for exactly 1 minute. Then she said quietly, "Tell me what's happening." I told her almost everything. The company, my name on the filings, the retirement account collateral, Terry Ann Roche. The letter Arthur had hidden. Patricia did not interrupt. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then she said, "Can you come to Columbia this week?" I drove to her office on a Wednesday afternoon. I brought everything I had gathered. Printed documents, notes, copied records. Patricia spread them across her conference table and read in silence for nearly an hour. I sat across from her and waited, the way you wait when someone is reading test results. When she looked up, her expression was careful. "June, I want to ask you something." "Of course. How much do you understand about the structure of these accounts?" I looked at her steadily. "More than Arthur thinks I do." Something changed in her face. "Good. Then let me show you what I'm seeing." What she showed me took another hour to explain fully. But the summary was this. Someone had constructed a financial arrangement using my identity, my name, my legal standing, without my knowledge or consent. The company existed, the loans existed, the collateral arrangements existed, and my signature appeared on documents authorizing them. I studied those signatures carefully when Patricia laid them in front of me. They were close, very close. Someone had practiced, but I had signed my name on thousands of documents over 40 years of working life, and I knew every curve and angle of it. "These weren't mine." "Forged," I said quietly. Patricia nodded. "That's how it looks. And that changes what this situation is considerably." I understood what she meant. This wasn't a husband keeping financial secrets. This was something with legal consequences. Significant ones. The kind that attract the attention of regulators and examiners and investigators who ask questions in formal settings. I drove home from Columbia in a strange calm, not the calm of someone who has made peace with something. The calm of someone who finally understands the shape of what they're dealing with. Fear had not disappeared. It had simply organized itself into something I could work with. That weekend, Arthur suggested we attend a civic fundraiser at the Greenville Country Club. I agreed. Partly because refusing would have been unusual. Partly because I suspected Terry Ann Roche would be there. The event was exactly as those events always are. Catered elegantly, organized to look effortless, full of people talking about generosity while networking aggressively. Arthur was in his element. He moved through the room the way he always did, greeting people by name, laughing at the right moments, making everyone feel individually noticed. I walked beside him. I smiled when required. And I watched. 40 minutes into the evening, I saw her. Terry Ann Roche was standing near the silent auction tables with 2 other people, wearing a dark green dress. She was exactly as the photographs suggested, composed, professionally polished. The kind of woman who makes other women feel slightly underdressed without appearing to try. I noticed Arthur notice her before she noticed him. That small adjustment in his posture. The almost invisible recalibration. After 31 years, I could read it the way you read fine print when you've stopped trusting the headline. When she approached our table, she was introduced by the event host as a guest of the Regional Insurance Council. She shook Arthur's hand with the careful ease of someone who has practiced appearing to be strangers. Then she turned to me. "You must be June." Her smile was warm and practiced simultaneously. "I am. And you're Terry Ann." Something shifted in her eyes, just briefly. We talked for perhaps 3 minutes. Nothing memorable was said. But when she moved away, I noticed the piece of jewelry she was wearing. A simple but distinctive rose gold bracelet. Elegant. Not inexpensive. Later that evening, while Arthur spoke with city council members across the room, I found a quiet corner, opened my phone, and checked the financial records I had photographed in Patricia's office. There it was. A purchase charge from a jewelry store in Charlotte, 4 months earlier. The amount was just over $4,000. The timing aligned perfectly with a business trip Arthur had taken to Charlotte. A trip that had been described to me as 2 days of client meetings. I stood in that quiet corner for a moment, looking at the bracelet from across the room. Then I folded my phone away and went back to stand beside my husband and smile at people who had no idea that the pleasant, slightly forgettable wife, in the navy blue dress, had spent the last 6 weeks quietly building a case. I didn't tell Gregory what I knew. Not yet. I was still deciding how much he understood and how much he had chosen not to see. The decision was made for me 9 days later. Gregory called me directly on a Tuesday afternoon. Not his father. Me. That alone was unusual enough to make me sit down. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something." His voice was tight. He sounded like a man who had been holding a heavy thing for a while and had finally reached the point where holding it was no longer possible. "I'm listening," I said. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I almost spoke again. Then he said, "How much do you know about the Caldwell situation?" My pulse steadied. "Tell me what you know, Gregory." Another silence. "Dad has been running a second set of accounts through a holding company. I thought it was just a tax strategy at first. He told me it was a restructuring arrangement. He said everything was legitimate. But I've been seeing figures that don't add up. Movement that doesn't correspond to any client activity I can identify. And some of the authorization documents have your name on them, Mom. I asked Dad about it 2 weeks ago, and he said you were aware of everything, Gregory." I kept my voice level. I was not aware of anything. The silence this time was different. Heavier. He said quietly, "I was afraid of that." I asked him then, the question I had been working toward for days, "How long have you known something was wrong?" He exhaled. "Maybe 8 months, 9. I kept hoping it was what he said it was. I closed my eyes for a moment. Then I asked the harder question. "Have you received anything? Any payment or compensation connected to those accounts?" The pause was just long enough. Then, he added a bonus to my draw last spring. A significant one. I didn't ask specific questions about where it came from. I sat with that for a long moment. My older son. My ambitious, capable, well-meaning son, who had spent 9 months making a choice I understood even as it broke something in me. I said, "Thank you for telling me the truth." He was quiet. Then, "What are you going to do?" I thought about Patricia, about the stack of documents waiting in a folder in my home office, about my retirement accounts, about a rose gold bracelet across a crowded room. "I'm going to finish what I started," I told him. "And I'd recommend you speak with your own attorney." He came to the house 2 evenings later. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had spent weeks reading documents at midnight, and I watched my son try to organize his face into something steadier than he felt. He looked like he hadn't slept. The guilt had been living inside him for months, and it showed. I asked him to tell me everything he knew. He did. It took almost 2 hours. Some of it I already had from documents. Some of it filled in the places where the paperwork had left gaps. What emerged was not a simple story of a man hiding money. It was something more deliberate. Arthur had used the holding company to redirect funds from certain client accounts through a structure that made the money look like legitimate investment income. Terry Ann Roche was not just a girlfriend. She was a business partner who had helped construct the arrangement and benefited from it directly. Her name appeared on property investments Arthur had made in Charlotte and Asheville, and once in Savannah. Properties I had never known about, properties purchased in some cases, with collateral that included accounts in my name. Gregory had known the company existed. He had suspected something was irregular. He had chosen, for 9 months, to believe his father's explanation. I don't say that to be cruel to Gregory. I say it because I understand it. It is hard to look directly at the person you've trusted most and see clearly. I had loved Arthur Bellamy for 31 years. I understood exactly how Gregory had convinced himself. When he stood to leave that night, he stopped at the door. "Mom!" I looked at him. He looked like the 7-year-old who used to sit on the kitchen counter while I made dinner, watching me cook and asking questions about everything. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." "I know," I said. "I know you are." His eyes filled. He nodded once. Then he left. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time after that. The house was quiet. Arthur was at a dinner meeting, or that was what he had told me. I had stopped assuming his explanations were complete. I picked up my phone and sent Patricia Weston a message. "I have more. Can we meet Friday?" Her reply came in under 2 minutes. "I'll clear my morning." The following 6 weeks were the most methodical of my life. Patricia and I met twice a week. She brought in a forensic accountant named Howard Park, a quiet man who wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck and never seemed surprised by anything he read, which I eventually understood was a professional quality and not indifference. Howard Park went through the documents with the patience of someone who had done this many times. He traced transactions, identified patterns, flagged inconsistencies. The picture that assembled itself was detailed and damning. The misuse of my identity was documented. The forged signatures were verified by a handwriting specialist. Patricia retained. The movement of funds through the holding company matched no legitimate business activity that Howard could account for. The retirement account situation was the part that kept me awake at night. Not because of the money itself, though that mattered, but because of the implication. Arthur had stood beside me for 31 years, slept in the same bed, sat across from me at breakfast, told me the accounts were protected, and the entire time, he had attached them to risk I had never agreed to and never known about. I kept that knowledge contained. I performed normalcy at home with a precision I hadn't known I was capable of. Arthur seemed increasingly distracted. More phone calls, more business dinners, shorter tempers, more elaborate neutrality whenever I asked simple questions. I believe he suspected something was shifting, but I don't think he understood what or how far along I was. The moment of exposure came on a Friday evening. Arthur came home early, which was unusual. He walked into the kitchen where I was reading and stood in the doorway, and something about his posture told me the distance we'd been maintaining for weeks was about to collapse. He said, "I need to ask you something directly." I set down my book. "All right. Have you been talking to anyone about our finances?" I looked at him steadily. "I've spoken to Patricia Weston." His jaw tightened. "About what specifically?" "About some arrangements that involve my name that I didn't authorize." The room was very quiet. Arthur stepped further in. He crossed his arms. His voice dropped in the way it dropped when he was working to stay controlled. "June, you don't understand the complexity of what I've been managing." There it was. The sentence that had followed me across 31 years in 100 different forms. "Explain it to me then," I said. He started talking. About the business climate, about cash flow, about strategic restructuring, about temporary arrangements that would have resolved themselves. The explanation was polished. It had clearly been rehearsed. For the first time, I recognized that the explanation wasn't for me. It was for whoever he imagined might eventually ask. I waited until he finished. Then I laid several documents on the kitchen table one at a time. The company registration, the loan agreements, the signature pages. Arthur looked at the papers. The color changed in his face slowly, like watching a light dim. "That's not my signature," I said quietly. "That is someone who studied my handwriting very carefully. But it isn't mine." He didn't answer. I placed the retirement account collateral document beside the others. And this wasn't something I agreed to. Still nothing. And these? I laid down 2 property records. The Charlotte property, the Asheville property. His name. Her name. Purchased using collateral from accounts we were supposed to share. Arthur sat down. He sat down heavily, in the way of a man whose legs have decided the performance is over before his face has. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then he said, "How much do you know?" "All of it," I told him. "Or close enough." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "June, if this becomes a formal situation, a lot of people get hurt." I looked at my husband, the man I had loved, the man who had, for reasons I still struggled to fully understand, chosen this path and told himself I would never see it. "Arthur," I said carefully, "it already is a formal situation. It became one when you put my name on documents I never signed." He was quiet for a long time after that. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller than I had heard it in years. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. I believe that was the truest thing he said to me that entire evening. Later, after Arthur had gone upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table alone. My phone was on the table beside me. I had been recording the conversation since before he walked through the door. 41 minutes, every word. Patricia had suggested it earlier that week. "Just in case," she'd said. I was glad I had listened. The months that followed were hard in ways I had not anticipated and easier in ways I hadn't expected either. Legal proceedings involve paperwork and patience, and an enormous amount of waiting between things happening. Patricia was with me through all of it. Howard Park prepared a full accounting. Statements were made. Accounts were examined. The regulatory attention that Patricia had predicted arrived, cautiously and then thoroughly. Arthur's brokerage did not collapse entirely. Many of his clients were untouched. Many of his employees were innocent people who simply worked there and had nothing to do with any of it. That mattered to me. I didn't want people who had done nothing wrong to suffer consequences that weren't theirs. But the structures Arthur had built using my name and my savings were dismantled, and the legal consequences of what had been done with my identity were documented in formal proceedings. Gregory hired his own attorney, as I had told him to. He was cooperative with investigators. The money he had received was addressed as part of the proceedings. I won't say that process was easy to watch. It was one of the hardest things I have experienced, watching my son answer for choices he made out of loyalty to someone who had not been worthy of it. We didn't speak for about 2 months. Then he called on a Sunday evening. I answered. He didn't have a speech prepared. He just said, "I should have told you. I know. I should have told you much sooner. I know that too." He was quiet. Then, "Are you okay?" I thought about that for a moment. "I'm getting there," I said. "I think I am." Dennis and his wife Paulette came up from Charlotte several times during those months. Paulette is a practical, steadfast woman, and I have always been grateful for her. She and Dennis would sit with me on the back porch, and we would talk about ordinary things when I needed ordinary things. We would talk about the hard things when I needed that too. They never pushed. They simply stayed close. Terry Anna Roche's involvement was addressed through the legal process. I never confronted her directly. I thought perhaps I would want to. I discovered I didn't. By the time everything came fully to light, I felt no particular need to look at her face and say anything. Whatever she had been to Arthur, the arrangement between them had not survived the scrutiny of daylight. She had moved on before the proceedings concluded. That part of the story closed without drama, and I was grateful for the quietness of it. The house in Greenville sold in the spring. It was a beautiful house. We had raised 2 boys there. We had spent 31 years of a marriage there, the good years and the quiet years, and the years I now understood had been built on something that was cracking beneath the surface without my knowledge. I walked through it one final time before the closing. Every room, every hallway, the kitchen where I had spent so many evenings reading documents at midnight. The back porch where I had sat with Dennis and held everything carefully inside. The bedroom where I had spent years lying awake beside a man and wondering why the silence between us felt strange. I said goodbye to the house, and to the version of myself who had lived inside it for so long, the one who had accepted the limits placed on her so gradually she had almost forgotten they were placed at all. I moved to a small town outside Asheville, a house with a wide front porch and a mountain view and neighbors who wave from their driveways. I wake early and drink my coffee outside and listen to the birds before the day begins to demand things. A few months after I settled in, I started attending a resource group at the local library for women going through major life transitions, divorce, widowhood, financial rebuilding. I went to listen. The second week, a woman in her 70s asked a question about reading a bank statement that she was clearly embarrassed to ask. I answered her simply and directly and without making her feel small. She looked at me afterward and said, "Do you do this professionally?" I laughed. "I used to. A long time ago. I started coming back. Then I started helping. Now I sit at a table every other Thursday afternoon with women, ranging in age from 52 to 81, and we talk about financial records and accounts statements and how to read the documents that come in official-looking envelopes. We talk about what questions to ask. We talk about the fact that understanding your own finances is not arrogance and not distrust. It is basic dignity. Some of them cry. Some of them laugh. All of them leave knowing something they didn't know when they arrived. Last spring, Arthur sent me a letter, handwritten. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I opened it. It was not long. There were no elaborate justifications, no complex explanations, no attempts to recast what had happened as something less than what it was. He wrote about regret. He wrote about the years he had spent telling people I didn't understand things and how much harm that had caused, and how clearly he could see now that it had been about protecting himself rather than describing me. He apologized for what had been taken without my knowledge. He apologized for the longer, quieter theft, the one that had gone on for decades before any document was forged, or any signature copied. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in a drawer. I don't say I've forgiven him. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right category. What I have is something quieter than forgiveness and more useful. A clear understanding of what happened and why, and the knowledge that it no longer has power over where I go from here. My retirement accounts were partially restored through the legal proceedings. Not entirely. There was damage that could not be undone in full, but enough. Enough to live quietly and with some measure of security. Enough to sit on my front porch and watch the mountains and feel, for the first time in a very long time, that the ground beneath me is mine. Gregory came to visit last fall. He drove up alone, and we sat on the porch for most of the afternoon. We talked about his sons, my grandsons, 8 and 11, who have their father's quick mind and, I like to think, something of their grandmother's patience. We talked about the brokerage, which he has restructured and is running with a transparency that he describes as almost excessive, which makes me smile. At one point, he said, "I keep thinking about how long this was happening and I didn't see it." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. "You saw what you were prepared to see," I told him. "That's true for most of us." He looked out at the mountains for a moment. "When did you know something was wrong?" "Really know? I thought about it honestly. I think I felt something long before I admitted it to myself," I told him. The feelings were there. I just kept setting them aside, because setting them aside was easier than what it meant to pick them up. He nodded slowly. "Don't do that with the things that matter," I said. "Not with the people you love and not with the numbers either. Ask the questions. Even when they're hard. Especially when they're hard." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and covered my hand with his, the way he used to when he was small and something had frightened him. We stayed like that for a while. The mountains were blue and still in the late afternoon light. The air smelled like autumn and wood smoke, and something I have no better word for than clean. I have been underestimated for most of my life. Not by everyone, but by the person whose opinion I was taught to trust most. And I allowed it, not because I was foolish, but because I was kind, and because I believed that love required a certain amount of making yourself smaller. What I know now is that the kindest thing you can do, for yourself and for everyone around you, is to take up exactly the space you're entitled to read the documents, to ask the questions, to know what is yours and how it works, and who is responsible for protecting it. Nobody handed me that knowledge. I had to remember that I already had it, and remembering, it turned out, was the most powerful thing I ever did.